So now we have to assume that the primary deficit is constant, just like we've done so far. Compute the long-run steady-state value of the real debt to GDP ratio in this economy. So what we have to do is that we have to recall the expression, the formula for the real debt to GDP ratio. When we calculate, when calculating the steady state value of the real debt to GDP ratio in a steady state, we have to recall one thing from steady state, and that is that in steady state, everything is constant. So in steady state, what is going on in steady state is that we have to drop all subscripts. We have to drop the subscripts because things are unchanged from one period to another. Therefore, our real debt to output ratio becomes the following. What we have to solve for is the real debt to GDP ratio, that is the B over Y. In order to solve for the steady state value, remember we have dropped all subscripts in this expression. The reason is we are simply computing the steady state value, and in the steady state everything remains constant from one period, say period t minus 1, to another period, say the next period, period t. In order to compute the steady state level, we have to solve for the real debt to GDP ratio. So what we can do is we can say, okay, this is the same as B over I, and then we subtract this term on both the left and right hand side, minus B over Y, 1 plus R minus G. That should be equal to government spending minus taxes over output. So now we get the real debt to GDP ratio minus real debt to GDP ratio times 1 minus real debt to GDP ratio times R minus real debt to GDP ratio times minus G, that becomes a plus G, plus the real debt to GDP ratio times the growth rate, that should be equal to the primary deficit over output in steady state. And that is just constant. It is 0.03 as we have assumed so far in the exercise. What is clear here is that B over Y cancels out with B over Y. And then we get a much simpler expression. Our expression says that B over Y times G should be equal to minus B over Y times the real interest rate, which should be equal to primary deficit relative to output, which is just 0.03. Factorizing, we have B over Y in both terms, so we can simplify G minus R. This should be equal to 0.03. So what do we get? If we want to solve for the steady state value of the real debt to GDP ratio, we simply divide by G minus R on both the left hand side and the right hand side. So now we get 0.03, and then G, that is the economy's growth rate, that is 0.06 minus the real interest rate, which is 0.04. This gives us 0.75, which is the same as 75%. So in the long run, its steady state value of the real debt to GDP ratio, we will have that the real debt to GDP ratio is only 75%. So as you can see, the real debt to GDP ratio is decreasing over time. The reason is that the primary deficit of GDP is constant, equal to 6% of GDP. but the economy grows at 6%. So output grows more due to the fact that output grows at 6% and the fact that the growth rate, that the primary deficit is a constant share of GDP in each and every period, we will have that the real debt to GDP ratio is decreasing over time. This can be explained through the growth rate of output, which is 6% and very high, and high relative to the primary deficit in each and every